the Jesuit order as a synagogue of Jews, Jesuits of Jewish ancestry and purity of blood laws in the early Society of Jesus. Robert Alexander Merrick's from Brill, and I'm obviously not going to go through this whole book. Okay, I believe I retrieved this from libgen.is, and so they talk about all of this basically from the very beginning. We have individuals that were in fact crypto Jews as part of the Jesuits. So that's why it's always, whenever people say it's not the Jews, it's the Jesuits or something like that, or it's not the Jews, it's the Freemasons, or it's not the Jews, it's X, Y, or Z. Okay, every single one of these organizations was infiltrated by Jewish people. And just say, well, this person was a Christian, or this person was Spanish, or this person was, we know that they were practicing Jews in secret. So, and where does this agenda come from? Where is this fulfilling Jesuit doctrine? Is the world around you fulfilling Jesuit doctrine? No, it's fulfilling Kabbalistic doctrine. Did the Freemasons ultimately follow, Knights Templar doctrine, or did they follow the precepts of the Kabbalah? They followed the precepts of the Kabbalah, as Albert Pike openly admits in his book. And so when you look at this Jesuit stuff, whose goals do they ultimately wind up accomplishing? Well, fast forward to Vatican II, and the Catholic Church is no longer official teaching that the Jews killed Jesus. And then by the 1960s, and they're not allowed to try and convert Jews anymore. So whose agenda won out? So I'm not just, spouting nonsense here. We're pointing to what the end results are. The side with the influence is the one that's going to win. And what side won? The Jewish side. So I want to just read some highlighted sections from here. Again, this would be a valuable resource to go through. A Jesuit told me briefly of the story of his Jewish lineage, while his other Sephardic ancestors went to Istanbul, Baghdad, Tehran, and to the Silk Road up to Shanghai, where they remain Jewish until today. Both his grandparents were descendants of Jews who settled in Palermo and Tribia, Sicily, where they converted to Catholicism in order to survive. In the baptismal registrars, which are still extant, they are described as usurers. We've seen elsewhere where in a couple places where they said, well, Jews aren't allowed to charge interest. Yet over and over and over again, the Catholic charge and the Roman charge and the charge of all these civilizations that encounter Jews is that that's exactly what they're doing. I guess, so essentially the Jewish position is everybody else in all those other countries that we got kicked out of were liars. And because look, it says in our books, even though we've already said that the oral tradition takes precedence based on both the Talmud and the Zohar and the Kabbalistic works, and we've already established that sometimes they literally say the opposite of what they actually do, etc., etc. We're going based on the feedback that the environment is telling us, the behaviors that they're actually engaged in, and what's actually manifesting in the real world. And usury is one of the things that was manifesting in the real world. More on that later. They kept practicing Judaism secretly. From Friday evening through Saturday evening, his grandfather would hide the image of baby Jesus from a large frame picture of St. Anthony that he kept in his home. It was, in fact, a wind-up music box. On Fridays, he would wind up the mechanism and push a button so that Jesus would disappear, hidden in the arms of the frame of the picture. On Saturday, he would then push the button again so that Jesus would come back from hiding into St. Anthony's arms. Had the Jesuit who wrote me this email asked to center the Jesuit order between 1593 and 1608, his Jewish ancestry would have been considered a legal impediment in his admission, just because his character would have been allegedly compromised by his impure blood, no matter how distant his Jewish ancestors were. Had he asked to become a Jesuit between 1608 and 1946, his background would have been reviewed up to the 5th generation, and the story of his heterodox paternal grandfather could, therefore, have been cited as a reason to prevent him from entering the order. However, had he become a professed Jesuit between 1540 and 1593, no law would have prevented him from following his vocation, even though not every confrere would have supported it. By the time Weissaup's on the scene in the 1700s, we have open admission of Jesuits, because by 1593 there's no impediment. So there's Jews all up and down the Jesuit order, by the time we get to 1593. And guess what? If they're crypto Jews who are hiding their ancestry, as we just looked at, and many did, because there's all sorts of ways to go about doing that in the 1500s. We don't have a digital ID system, right? So that being the case, and as you can see by going through this book, if you're so inclined, there were already Jewish Jesuits who just said that they weren't Jews, and they were practicing crypto Jews within the Jesuits. The complex nature, magnitude, and early society of Jesus and the role of Christians of Jewish ancestry played in the order. Purity of blood was an obsessive concern that originated in the mid-15th century Spain based on the biased belief of the unfaithfulness of the deicide Jews, not only endured in those who converted to Catholicism, but also been transmitted by the blood of their descendants, regardless of their sincerity in professing the Christian faith. Traditional mistrust of the Jew as an outsider now gave way to an even more alarming fear of converso as an insider. And of course, even though they're trying to characterize it in a certain way, I mean, that fear was very much well-founded. And just historically, I mean, at this point, we're in the 1500s, you had 1,500 years of this practice taking place. Even before the Talmud was fully codified, we'll try and touch on some of the Roman stuff, they were already establishing that they were infiltrating the society, these upper crusts of Roman society, money lending, et cetera, all that stuff was already taking place. So this has been in the playbook before the Kabbalah, before any of this stuff. Does that mean every single Jew is going about doing this? No. But can I tell you which ones are and which ones aren't with absolute certainty? I can't. I can't do that. Because once you start engaging in tactics like this, it becomes really hard to pull the pieces together. The high number of Jews who converted to Christianity as a result of pogroms and as a result of the royal edict of 1492 constituted a much greater hindrance to the monarch's vision of Catholic national identity than they had during the Visigoth rule in Spain prior to the Muslim invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in 711. And, I mean, if you want solidarity within your nation, again, I'm not Catholic, I'm not Jewish, I'm not Muslim, okay? But if you want solidarity within your borders, having a state religion is a good idea. I'm not telling you you have to believe in any particular religion, but there's a reason that these rulers want this, and there's a reason that they expel people that don't adhere to that, because they're going to try and promote whatever agendas it is that they want, and that's going to cause disruptions within your society because people have strong feelings about these things. So I'm not saying that there's a perfect solution here, but it's quite obvious why any ruling order would want to mandate a state religion, and if you can't get on board with that, you got to get out. So once again, there we have additional references reflect the identification of conversos with Jews, even though after the expulsion there were officially no Jews in Spain. Claiming a precedent of royal and canon law, it barred all Jews who converted to Christianity and their descendants from holding public offices or testifying in Christian courts of law because of the conversos' infamy, inability, and indignity, which allegedly stemmed from their untrustworthy faith and was proven by their continued Judaizing. And so this is cited here in reference 6, and they have the exact quote here. It's, of course, in Spanish. According to the Sentencia Estu Aduo, the history of the city of Toledo testified the long-time converso plotting that can be traced back to the alliance of their Jewish ancestors with the Muslim conquerors, which had caused the death or enslavement of many old and pure lindos, or Christians. So for the historical context of that, you can reference 7 Muslim Jewish collaboration with Muslim conquerors, the Serranos, Los Conversos by Roth, and Conversos Inquisition, page 91. According to experts, this is the first use of the term impure in relation to Christians who were not of Jewish lineage, which would constitute a shift from socio-political into a racial approach. More recently, royal money that was astutely stole, the conversos had oppressed, destroyed, and robbed the majority of their property in the city of Toledo. They had been able to sneak into influential government posts. This animosity that you see, and for many people that aren't aware, there were many Muslim raids, and I did talk a little bit about this, although not back in this time frame, about the Black Sea slave trade back in my race lectures on slavery. I did a quick little slavery thing, not in any sort of significant detail, but it talked about the black slave trade, sea slave trade, and how basically Arab raiders were coming in, stealing Caucasian people on a scale very similar to the Atlantic slave trade, that was in some extent overlapping with the Atlantic slave trade, in which millions were taken. And in that same lecture, it referenced that many of the lead merchants in charge of this slave trade were in fact Jewish. So if you're a Catholic and you're in this country that's a Christian majority, and you know Jews are practicing this stuff in secret, and you know that they're collaborating with Muslims to abduct and steal people from your land and sell them into slavery, for the women to often be sex slaves and the men to be forced into hard labor, usually castrated, by the way, because that was the Muslim practice, was to castrate their slaves. You're going to have some animosity towards Jews. So this idea that we're just being picked on, we're just these sad folks that are always bullied. No, you were collaborating with foreigners to have women sent off to be turned into sex slaves. Again, the Borgias and all this kind of stuff predate this. So I'm not saying that you can't have criticisms of the Catholic Church as a whole. That's totally fine. I'm fine with that. When you've had hundreds of years of infiltration at this level, and who was the founder of the Jesuit order in question, the one where Weishaupt was receiving training and he had this accusation of carrying out a Jesuit agenda, right, by some of the other Illuminists. So who was Ignatius of Loyola? Venerated as Saint Ignatius of Loyola, he was a Spanish Catholic priest and theologian who, with 6 companions, founded the religious order of the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, who we've been talking about, and became the first superior general in Paris in 1541. Ignatius envisioned the purpose of the Society of Jesus to be a missionary work and teaching. In addition to the vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty, Loyola instituted a 4th vow of obedience to the Pope to engage in projects ordained by the pontiff. Jesuits were instrumental in leading the Counter-Reformation. So you have the Reformation movement, right? People think of Martin Luther and his theses that he nailed onto the door. And so you have this, counter approach to Catholic power. And so this was sort of the SEAL Team 6 of the Catholic Church, or so it is stated. As a former soldier, Ignatius paid particular attention to the spiritual formation of his recruits and recorded his method in spiritual exercises. Now, this spiritual exercises thing, it very much sounds like the Hasidic or Hasidism stuff that I talked about in how mesmerism was incorporated into Jewish thought. And that's because a lot of this stuff is. The method became known as Ignatian spirituality. He was beatified in 1609 and canonized as a saint in 1622. His feast day is celebrated on the 31st of July. He was born in a castle of Loyola in the municipality of Azpeitia Gipuzkoa in the Basque region of Spain. His parents, Don Beltran Ibanez de Oñez y Loyola and Donna Maria, were of minor nobility from the clan of Loyola who were involved in the Basque War of the Bands. Their manor house was demolished on the orders of the King of Castile in 1456 for their depredations in Gipuzkoa, with Inigio's paternal grandfather being expelled to Andalusia by Henry IV. Inigio was the youngest of their 13 children. Their eldest son, Juan Perez, has soldiered in forces commanded by Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba, but died fighting in the Italian wars. Okay, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on him. I just want to skim over. They talk about his military career, his religious conversion and visions. He dreamed about imitating the saints, devoted himself to following the example of Francis of Assisi, and he went on this sort of pilgrimage. They talk about his period of study, the foundation of the Jesuit order, which was approved in 1540, and death and canonization, as well as his legacy. Okay, so you can see the sort of established lineage here, but they don't say anything about any non-Spanish ancestry. Okay, just pointing that out. And looking at the introduction here, the founder of the Jesuits, Ignatius of Loyola, who we just looked at, had many contacts with influential Erasmus during his studies at Alcalá de Henares, as we shall see in Chapter 2. His positive approach to conversos and Jews predates the Society of Jesus in 1540, despite the assertion of many experts to the contrary. So in other words, what? This guy was interacting with, very in favor of, and in communication with many, many Jewish people before he even founded the Jesuits. His openness towards conversos may have been motivated by the financial support he had sought from their network in Spain and in the Spanish Netherlands before founding the society of what he would continue to seek as the superior general of the Jesuits. So where did a lot of the funding from the Jesuits come? It came from the Jews. In spite of his down-to-earth concern, Loyola was undoubtedly, as Henry Kamen powerfully put it, a deep and sincere spiritual Semite. Even though Pope Paul IV of Siliaco's former pupil, King Philip II, ratified the archbishop's statutes in 1555 and 1556 respectively, in spite of the latter's earlier opposition to it, the authority and impetuous character of Siliceo did not deter Ignatius and Loyola and his converso successor Diego Lainez. Encouraged by their close converso collaborators, they vigorously opposed the inquisitors' attempts to preclude conversos from joining the Jesuits. They also had a counter-Jesuit provincial superior for Spain and Loyola's relative, Antonio Araoz, who, abetted by the penitent, the Prince of Eboli, made himself the Jesuit harbinger of the Iberian policy of Pureza de Sangre. So wait a minute, what does all that mean? Diego Lainez is a converso. Immediately following Ignatius of Loyola, we have this figure. Diego Lainez, died 1565, was a Spanish Jesuit priest theologian, a new Christian of converted Jewish descent, and the second superior general of the Society of Jesus after the founder of Ignatius of Loyola. That came into the Jesuits, was Jewish. And Ignatius of Loyola got some of his funding for the founding of the Jesuit order from Jews. So are we starting to see the problem with saying it's the Jesuits or it's this or that group when we, as I already showed, we know that there's Marranos and crypto Jews who are still practicing Jews in secret, and they openly tried to keep them from being a part of this stuff. And what happened? Literally from the very beginning, they were a part of the founding of and development of this order. He was one of the 7 men who, with Ignatius, formed the original group of Friends in the Lord, later the Society of Jesus, taking the Montmartre Church, the vows of personal poverty and chastity in the footsteps of Christ, and committing themselves to going to Jerusalem. So one of the founding members of the Jesuits was this figure, a Jew. Now it goes on to discuss how there was this anti-converso lobby within the Jesuits, including other high-ranking officials. Assistant General Benedetto Palmillo had fueled their anti-converso bias. It is evident in a manuscript that has remained virtually unknown for more than 400 years. In it, the author relates how the multitude and insolence of Spanish neophytes had been growing. According to him, the first 2 superior generals, Ignatius of Loyola and Diego Lainez, had excluded conversos, but conversos subsequently had found refuge in Lainez's successor, Francisco de Borja, except for they clearly weren't aware that Lainez himself was a converso. There's these higher level Jesuits that are trying to fight to keep conversos out, not knowing that literally their leader, the second guy in the order, was a converso. And when we look at this figure of Loyola himself, it is now cliche to begin an account of Loyola's Judeophilia by quoting the testimonies of Pedro de Ribadeneira about Ignatius' desire to be an ethnic Jew. More about Pedro in a moment. Pedro, whose name derives from a Galatian town in the province of Lugo, was born November 1st, 1527, to the converso Alvaro Hisulio Ortiz de Cisneros, later governor of Toledo, a legal city council in Toledo, and Catalino de Villabolos y Ribadeneira. So here he is. And as the biographer of Ignatius of Loyola from Toledo, is the author of the first official biography of the Jesuit founder. So this guy, this Pedro, was the first one to have an official biography for Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola, which had been in numerous editions in various languages, caption reads that Ribeira was Ignatius's accurate biographer. However, a contemporary French historian, Marcel Battalion, charged him with the crime of hagiographic deformation. So he's saying, hey, there's a problem with your biography. Indeed, Ribeira was a closet converso, concealed the fact that at the Inquisition in Alicante had accused Loyola of being a crypto-Jew, and modern scholarship has established Ribeira's Jewish genealogy. So the guy, and we'll touch on him in a minute, the guy who is writing Loyola's biography is ethnically Jewish and a convert, and we know all this stuff about crypto-Judaism. And what's left out of sort of the Jesuit order being canceled part is that during the Inquisition, they suspected Loyola of being a crypto-Jew himself, Ignatius of Loyola, who said multiple times over he was in favor of, let's get Jews in here, and said that he basically wished he were Jewish. Watched by his converso uncle, Pedro de Ortiz, the emperor's ambassador in Rome, Pedro stayed at Rome's palace for 14 months. After having raised the charming yet restless lad in Jesuit spirituality for 2 years, Ignatius planned that Pedro would study in Paris, but he ended up in Spanish Flanders due to the Franco-Imperial War. After having founded a college there, he returned to Rome with the Venetian Juan Geronimo Domenico in 1543. Then he studied for 4 years, so he literally lived with Ignatius Loyola. Among many episodes of the spiritual father's life, he collected Ignatius' hagiography. He recounted that one day when many of us were dining together, speaking of himself about a certain topic, he said that it would have been taken as a special grace from our Lord to come from Jewish lineage. This is Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, speaking. And adding a reason, he said, why imagine that a man can be a kinsman by blood of Christ our Lord and of Our Lady, the glorious Virgin Mary. On another, he observed, Father, make the same statement, which I recounted above. He crossed himself and exclaimed, a Jew, and he spit it on the ground at this name. Our father said to him, now, Signor Pedro de Zarate, let us be reasonable. Listen to what I have to say. And then he gave him so many reasons for this that he really persuaded him to wish to be of Jewish lineage. So another Catholic person in the order was detested at the concept of being a Jew. And remember, we have years of sort of Catholic conflict with Jewish ideology and Catholic conflict with the idea that they killed Christ. And remember, during this inquisitorial stuff, they're going to uncover the Kabbalah and the Zohar and the Talmud and all these sorts of things and the burnings of the Talmuds that have taken place at various periods in time. They knew what they were teaching about Christians, okay? And this guy is within the Jesuits, the supposed secret order within the esoteric order within the Catholic Church, and he's going around hiring conversos and trying to convince them it would be better to be of Jewish lineage. And it reminds me very much of Charlie Chaplin when asked if he was Jewish. He said, no, I don't have that high distinction. And then it turns out years later he was in fact Jewish, so he literally lied about not being Jewish openly. This is much, much later. One of the essential founders in the elements of Hollywood, and pretended not to be Jewish. And on top of that, you still have sources that argue that he isn't, even though we've established by birth that he is. So there's still people trying to muddy the waters as it relates to Jewish ancestry today, of people that have confirmed Jewish ancestry. It's really bizarre. He refers there to a Jew who served Pope Paul III and later entered Loyola's community of catechumens, where he established a friendship with Ignatius. So once again, another Jewish person in his circle. Diego de Guzman provides this account. If our Lord would like me to choose this lineage to be born, I would choose not other than yours, and the reason for this is that the Lord himself wanted to choose this lineage for him and to be a son of Abraham and David and other patriarchs and kings, and this was not the Holy Mother Virgin Mary with her husband Saint Joseph, whom he used to call my father. These expressions of Loyola's Judeophilia are usually juxtaposed with an account of an interrogation by the Vicar General of the diocese who suspected Inigo of crypto-Judaism, most likely because of his numerous contacts with Alumbrados and Erasmus. Loyola's Converso secretary, so again, his biographer is a Jewish convert. His secretary is a Jewish convert. He's telling other Catholics it would be better if they were Jewish. That's the best lineage to have. When after the time described, the vicar of WellHereweGo came to question him and on the other things asked him if he recommended observance of the Sabbath, he replied, "For Saturdays I recommend special devotion to Our Lady, and I know no other observances for Saturday. Moreover, in my country there are no Jews," which is, of course, we know not actually the case. It was officially the case, but we know that there's crypto Jews practicing in secret. Again, the Marrano/crypto Jew stuff I talked about earlier. Vincenzo unfairly became a synonym of the old Christian, an expression of his 16th century soul, which later would be spiritually transformed into Ignatius' desire to be a Jew by blood. That conversion would occur as a result of a close friendship established with the converso Diego Lainez. Interestingly enough, some historians omitted the question posed by Vicar General in their detailed accounts of Loyola's trial. So what are we seeing here? There's this concept of the Sabbath being on Saturday versus Sunday, and, Jews' Sabbath is on a different day than the Christians, and he doesn't give a knock the ball straight out of the park answer that a Christian would give as far as celebration of the Sabbath. And the author of this book is noting that many biographers, many recounters of this history leave out this question. What are we seeing here as it relates to this? There's potential for crypto Jews all over the place from the very beginning of the Jesuit order, and Jews provided money for it. So even if Ignatius of Loyola is not Jewish by birth, he's certainly a Jewish sympathizer. There's certainly multiple individuals that have carried and hidden elements of this story that make this far more suspicious, which would suggest that they're trying to hide it. And there definitely were Jewish eyes within the Jesuit order regardless. Whether they or not they controlled the order outright, why are so many people of prominent positions conversos? And I mean, you can see the internal conflicts within the Catholic Church that resulted after the fact with a lot of this type of stuff. So I'm not going to go through this whole book, but this is a good resource to have and then match up with other sources to help flesh out this picture more clearly. So here's the biographer, Pedro de Ribadeneyra, a Spanish hagiographer, Jesuit priest, companion of Ignatius Loyola, and a Spanish Golden Age ascetic writer, born in Toledo, Spain, son of Pedro Gonzalez, grandson of Hernando Ortiz de Cisneros, whom Fernando IV has honored with the governorship of Toledo and important missions. Okay, so they discuss his lineage here, but not much else. So just keep that in mind. That's all Wikipedia really says about this guy. They don't point out anything about his Jewish lineage. They don't point anything about him censoring the biography. Every single time the mainstream source, the mainstream article, what have you, every single time they either ignore or say there's no evidence that he's Jewish, or they say there was anti-Semitism present. How come you never ever see anybody pointing out that there's a culpability here as it relates to this part of the Jewish belief system? Any Wikipedia article, well, this person, Schneerson, said this or this about the Gentile soul, which I can prove from primary sources. How can you not see Jewish control when the Jewish perspective is always emphasized, sympathized with, and relevant details to the story? Because they talk about the persecutions of the Catholic Church, but they don't mention any of these other things like collaboration with Muslim leaders or any of this stuff. Always gets ignored, never gets mentioned. What are we starting to see here?